Common misconception: the US founding fathers were never promoting democracy. Even in the 1770s, they were making this rhetoric about a democratic republic. It was false. They were laying the seeds for what will eventually become fascism, believing in racial supremacy, foundation of slavery, and wanted to establish an aristocratic colonial empire. In fact, George Washington himself has stated that he is against democracy because he said that too much democracy leads to freedom, and the United States is a sleeping empire waiting to happen. George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and other similar founding fathers wanted to expand. They believed that the imperialism and colonization of the entirety of the Americas. Even Benjamin Ross, who was one of the ideological founding fathers of eugenics, believing that non-white skin color, like any other race, is a disease waiting to be cured. And Thomas Jefferson has studied multiple racist things throughout his life, especially his only published work. They make explicit eugenics and racial supremacist statements. So, we need to understand where this comes from an excellent essay, academic essay called The 7080s, The Founders versus the People. The judgment might seem excessively harsh, but consider the facts. Across the American colonies, the revolutionary 1770s were at a time of relative democracy. In the struggle against the British, gentry and the lower classes to some extent united under the banner of white male popular empowerment. The state adopted strictly democratic constitutions, none more impressive than the Pennsylvania 1776, which was heavily influenced by Thomas Paine's approach to democracy, which would be the precursor to socialism in many ways. And in the Massachusetts, in many cases in Mississippi during the Shays Rebellion, they were going to a more anarchist direction, which established a new legislation, annual elections for every representative, a weak governorship that could not veto laws the legislature passed, the election rather than the appointment of most offices in the state and county governments, and the enfranchisement of nearly all adult men, even those who owned no property. But this changed in the 1780s. In fact, when Thomas Paine published his work on the rights of man, what type of government he wanted. A month later, John Adams published his own paper criticizing it going to a more authoritarian direction, which became the official policy of the founding fathers. The gentry had tried of an excess of democracy, to quote Alexander Hamilton. Others were less restrained, decrying democratic tyranny, a republican frenzy, a prevailing rage of excessive democracy. And remember, Alexander Hamilton promoting the idea of electoral monarchy. And in the early years, they genuinely considered the idea to establish a monarchy and trying to take total control of the state government. Given the shortage of gold and silver during the war with the British government had issued paper money would soon lead to high inflation. This was blamed simplistically on the democratic character of the government, the imbecility of popularly elected politicians, and most of the elite gentlemen came to view all government issues, paper, money, as evil, to be done away with. They also disliked the social and cultural manifestation of democracy, the leathery spirit that raised commoners in their own eyes and lowered the gentry. The ultra-rich fancier Robert Morris represented his class when he sought to strip power from all of these quote-unquote vulgar sores whose narrow optics can see but the little circle of selfish concerns. End quote. The political and economic agenda that Morris and his associates championed bore remarkable, if any surprising resemblance to neoliberalism. Morris wanted a government to channel money to the wealthy. Terry Bottom's right, either through direct payouts or by privatizing the most lucrative parts of the state and turning them over to new for-profit corporations owned and run by the gentry. One of the most powerful figures in American history, Morris founded in 1781 the first private bank of the United States, the Bank of North America, in part to remove finance for democratic control. No government but banks will issue paper money. Private corporations, unlike government, will be immune to public pressure for greater supply of money and will therefore be able to prevent inflation. Actually, the actual shortage of money during the 1780s showed that Morris was too pessimistic. Even in states where legislators did on occasion print money, they certainly did not do so to the extent that people desired. The 1780s were a time of ferocious class conflict, with most of the eventual framers of the U.S. Constitution facing off alongside Robert Morris and the majority of the gentry against the middling and lower classes, overwhelmingly agrarian. On the one side were the wealthy speculators and government IOUs who had bought these bonds for pennies on the dollar from the farmers, artisans, and soldiers to whom they had been given during the war as payment for goods and services. They originally their original holders expected the bond to deprecate any money right away, sold them to whatever they could get. Speculators, on the other hand, could afford to wait years for the government to redeem the bonds and had the political clout to insist that they had to be paid at or near the certificate's full face value, even though at the time of issuance the certificate's market value was far below this. The state and federal war debt, most of which speculators thus bought up, was enormous, about $27 million. To pay the interest on the war debt, many states tend to impose the same type of fiscal and monetary regime on the populace, and more recently the International Monetary Fund was favored, oppressive taxes, a tight money supply, and the courtesy of public services, such as government-run loan offices that gave cheap credit to farmers and artisans. Since both private creditors and bond speculators were averse to paper money, governments compelled debtors and taxpayers to pay with gold and silver, but the war years had drained the country of gold and silver, making it impossible for the people to pay. The nationwide tragedy that resulted has been compared to the Great Depression of the 1930s. Tsunamis of property foreclosures swept out hundreds of thousands of families, and economic activity plummeted. Public trade and private transaction and human life. Petitioners in Pennsylvania protests are nearly reduced to the total stagnation. On the other side of the economic divide, then, were masses of ordinary people who found that their troubles were much worse in the 1780s than they had been in the last years of British control, when their hardship had driven them to rebellion and war. Have not expanded our blood and our treasure to expel from the land a set of invaders who sought to rule over us as taskmasters. They exclaimed in the mid 1780s that, and I quote, "we shall now become bondsmen to people of our own country." End quote. The irony was appalling that the victims fought back. In fact, they were sought to extract significant concession and relief measures in some states by elected legislators sympathetic to their plight. Farmers and artisans benefited from temporary suspension of tax collection. Violent resistance, such as Shays' Rebellion in Massachusetts in 1786 and 87, frightened the governments into being more lenient in their fiscal and monetary policies. Local and country officials often were sympathetic to the suffering of their neighbors and refused to enforce the law or carry out orders. For example, country tax officers could delay collections. Some sheriffs obstructed or prevented property foreclosures. Justice of the peace refused to prosecute people for non-payment of taxes. Nor were state militias always of use in enforcing tax collection, for it was frequently militiamen who were leading the anti-tax protests. All this in the mid-1780s, sustainable mitigating hardship, which meant that it was the tremendous irate to the elite. For one thing, it prevented bondholders and creditors from being paid as much as regularly as they wanted. For another, it fostered economic and political uncertainty, which made for a bad investment climate. European investors, in particular, were leery of sending their capital to the land that was so riven by conflict. How could a country develop it could attract investment? Various solutions were possible to the political and economic instability of the 1780s. Spokesmen of the aggrieved masses made reasonable proposals that were relatively fair to both sides of the class struggle. They called for a revaluation of war debt certificates, progressive taxation, limits on land speculation, ban on for-profit corporations, and other measures that would alleviate spiral wealth inequality and strengthen democracy. Such proposals were consistent with the people's understanding of republicanism, an understanding that differed from the aristocrats like James Madison, George Washington, Near John Adams, Alexander Hamilton, and Newton Randolph. As Gordon would describe in The Radicalism of the American Revolution, these latter men considered an axiomatic that because only an elite of disinterested British property gentlemen was capable of pursuing the public good over the selfish private ends, the success of the republic required that such men hold power. It was necessary to tame the wilderness of democracy, i.e., the effectively disenfranchise the majority in order for the elected civil virtue to flourish. The people, on the other hand, tend to have a less naive view of the world. As Gilman from Pennsylvania said in one of their many petitions to the state government, no observation is better supported than this, that a country cannot long preserve its liberty where a great inequality of property takes place. Some of their legislators agreed. They declared that for-profit corporations were totally destructive of the equality which ought to prevail in a republic. Farmers wrote that we observed with great anxiety wealthy incorporated companies taking possessions of public and private property, and condemned processes that made a few men sufficiently powerful by privileges and wealth to purchase or to destroy the property and right of their fellow citizens. Evidently, these farmers had more sophisticated political understanding than James Madison and his idealistic college did, and at least insofar as they understood that the real danger of republicanism was not democracy, but rather sharp inequality of property. The Constitution, triumph of reaction. Needless to say, it was not the farmers' Democratic vision that ultimately prevailed, but Robert Morrison and other anti-democrats across the state organized a new constitutional convention in 1787 to remedy the defects of the Articles of Confederation, which is to say, to write a new constitution that would more adequately insulate government from democratic control. The convention was not sold this way to the people, of course. Its purpose instead was supposed to be find ways to give government more power to protect shipping and to negotiate trade deals with foreign nations. Secretly, though, most delegates had one goal mainly in mind: to make America more attractive to investment. As Woody Holden argued, the linkship to that endeavor, he says, was taking power away from the state and away from the people. In other words, the euro was founded from the motive and from the principle of serving capital. The very structure of its political system was chosen so as chiefly to attract investors, to be a tool of capital accumulation. It is probably the only country in history which this is the case, but those who are familiar with US history so full of subservient to capitalism, such as revelation should not be surprising. Many of the devices that the Constitution framework proposed to limit democracy were not adopted at the convention in Philadelphia. The delegates had to navigate between two contradictory imperatives. On the one hand, they wanted to make it forever impossible for states to adopt the kinds of debtor relief and taxpayer relief legislation that the 1780s had seen. On the other hand, it could not make a constitution so anti-democratic that the state and the people would not ratify it. Because of this second consideration, for example, Madison's proposal that the U.S. Senate be able to veto state legislature in all cases whatsoever was rejected. The same fate befell a helmeted extreme proposal that the Senate and President be elected for life as a way to provide government with maximum protection against democracy. Most delegates favored Hamilton's plan, but they knew they would prevent Constitution from being ratified. Nevertheless, in its finished form, the Constitution, hardly a model of democracy, while Senator's term was not 9 years long, as Madison wanted. 6 years was long enough because it wrote insulate to the Senate from the popular will. The Senate's very existence, of course, as a body explicitly reminiscent of Britain's House of Lords, was a significant check and balance against the people, as was the indirect election of its members and of the President by means of the Electoral College. The Constitution framers even managed to limit democracy in the House of Representatives by making elections districts so large that the ordinary people would have a hard time getting elected. Men of wealth would be much more successful than others in making their names and views known in large districts. To say it differently, large districts would divide the community, as Madison said, and makes it difficult for the non-wealthy to unite in the pursuit of a common interest. End quote. Furthermore, members of the House and the Senate could not be recalled, and constituents were not given the right to instruct their representatives how to vote on a particular issue, a right that even as a British colonist many of them had. As for the presidency, it would be a very powerful position that could veto any dangerously democratic law that somehow made it through the gauntlet of deliberate cumbersome and convoluted machinery for passing legislation in Congress. The president will also be responsible for making most major appointments in the national government, a power that under the Articles of Confederation had reside in the legislative branch. The Supreme Court, appointed not elected, has its part to play in the checking of the imprudence of democracy to quote Alexander Hamilton, though the judicial review could overturn both federal and state legislation. In this way, Madison proposed that the national government has some means of vetoing inclusively democratic state laws was salvaged. In case of such protection were not enough, language was written into the Constitution that expressly forbade most of the pro-debtor, pro-taxpayer laws states had passed in the 1780s. Article 1 deprived state of control over the war debt, thus preventing them from paying worth as speculators the market worth rather than much higher face value of the certificates they held. As Secretary of the Treasury, Hamilton, who had been mentored by the ultra-conservative Robert Morris, gave these speculators a tremendous windfall to the outrage of the farmers. The Congress was granted the power to directly tax citizens instead of relying on the state to do so, and could break mass resistance to tax policy by bringing in militias from surrounding states. Section 10 of Article 1 was especially momentous. In red, in part, no state shall emit bills of credit, make any things but gold and silver, coin and tender in payments of debts, nor pass any law impairing the obligation on contracts. In one swoop, this established a political economic regime that overwhelmingly favored creditors. It prohibits states from using their own paper currency, effectively destroying state-run land banks, i.e., loan offices. As Bolton noted, and the system of public long-term low-cost credit have been very effective and enormously popular with farmers. Debt arbitration was outlawed. In general, states were prohibited from rescuing debtors. It is worth noting that parenthetically, the recent fashion of originalism or original intent or strict constructionism in legal interpretation of the Constitution are predicted in the neoliberal context, given that the farmers and their contemporaries thought of now revered document as broadly anti-democratic. Originalism can be a useful tool of hypercapitalism. Most ordinary citizens were not too fond of this elitist constitution, but they were so scattered and had so few resources compared to the Federalists who supported it that it was difficult for them to mount an effective opposition. The Federalists, moreover, did not play nice. They were prepared to go to almost any length to get the Constitution ratified. In some states, such as Pennsylvania, the organized a ratification convention before the opposition had a chance to mobilize. They gave the district that favored ratification a disproportionately large number of delegates. Their ownership of most newspapers allowed them to conduct a major propaganda campaign to suppress the voices of anti-federalists. Violent friends were made against anti-federalist printers. Authentic pamphlets and newspapers were stopped and destroyed. Federalist postmasters intercept and suppress anti-federalist mail. Writers resorted to lies about the provisions the Constitution contained and the process they had brought into being. On the other hand, many people were reconciled to it on the basis of legitimate consideration. For one thing, since the national government had the power to impose tariffs on imports, most people's taxes would likely be reduced. The government could rely primarily on tariffs for its revenue, not direct taxation on citizens, has been the case in the 1780s. Even more importantly, Federalists committed to adding the Bill of Rights to the Constitution after it was ratified. This was something that many citizens from across the country insisted on. Woody Holton makes an apt observation on this point. It's remarkable but rarely noted irony, he says, that Americans own their most cherished rights, among them freedom of speech and religion, the right to trial by jury, and protection against self-incrimination and illegal search and seizure, not at the altars but the Constitution, but the irreverent enemies. The Bill of Rights was conceived to the rabble. If the farmers of the 1780s were alive today, however, they might feel vindicated. This isn't the place to review the entire history of the U.S. capitalism on steroids, but it would hardly be controversial to say that the anti-democratic, anti-working class political framework the founders put in place had been perfectly adapted to the ambitions of a predatory economic system. It's also as if capitalism has reached back from the future to move its paws like chess pieces against capital's early opponents, who were finally checkmated when the Constitution was, for all fair means and foul, ratified, and after that it would be smoother sailing for the developing American capitalism. although even then its development had to continually confront mass resistance, eventually and always with the decisive aid of the peculiar structures of the American polity, and point was reached when the wealth could be so concentrated, the political system could be so captured by the corporate oligarchy, and ordinary people could be so desperate for change that they would elect a monstrosity like Donald J. Trump. So here we are, still burdened with political leaders who, like the constitutional framework, are conceived above all to protect creditors, financiers, and investors who had the same wisdom, quote unquote, as most of the founders in their desire to undermine democracy, whether through gerrymandering, major propaganda campaigns, or cunning congressional tricks of obstructing political legislation, or simply the appointment of wealthy friends to important government positions. The growing democratic resistance in the tradition not of the great man who wrote the Constitution, but of their enemies. The United States was, by the people, a more democratic, revolutionary movement. Unlike the founding fathers, with the sole exception of Thomas Paine, este anti-democratic, pro-aristocracy, pro-oligarchy, pro-plutocracy, pro-imperialism, pro-colonialism, pro-racism, pro-slavery, pro-racial supremacy, and more things. They were the ideological founders that will eventually become fascism.